Leviticus chapter 5. Leviticus chapter 5. And if a soul sin, and hear the voice of swearing, and is a witness, whether he hath seen or know of it, if he do not utter it, then he shall bear his iniquity. Or if a soul touch any unclean thing, whether it be a carcass of an unclean beast, or a carcass of an unclean cattle, or the carcass of an unclean creeping things, and if it be hidden from him, he also shall be unclean and guilty. Or if he touch the uncleanness of man, whatsoever uncleanness it be, that a man shall be defiled withal, and it be hid from him, when he knoweth of it, then he shall be guilty. Or if a soul swear, pronouncing with his lips to do evil or to do good, whatsoever it be that a man shall pronounce with an oath, and it be hid from him, when he knoweth of it, then he shall be guilty in one of these. And it shall be, when he shall be guilty in one of these things, that he shall confess that he hath sinned in that thing, and he shall bring his trespass offering unto the Lord for his sin which he hath sinned, a female from the flock, a lamb or a kid of the goats, for a sin offering. And the priest shall make an atonement for him concerning his sin. And if he be not able to bring a lamb, then he shall bring for his trespass which he hath committed 2 turtle doves or 2 young pigeons unto the Lord, one for a sin offering, and the other for a burnt offering. And he shall bring them unto the priest, who shall offer that which is for the sin offering first, and wring off his head from his neck, but shall not divide it asunder. And he shall sprinkle of the blood of the sin offering upon the side of the altar, and the rest of the blood shall be wrung out at the bottom of the altar. It is a sin offering. And he shall offer the second for a burnt offering according to the manner, and the priest shall make an atonement for him for his sin which he has sinned, and it shall be forgiven him. But if he be not able to bring 2 turtle doves or 2 young pigeons, then he that sinned shall bring for his sin his offering the 10th part of an ephah of fine flour for a sin offering. He shall put no oil upon it, neither shall he put any frankincense thereon, for it is a sin offering. Then shall he bring it to the priest, and the priest shall take his handful of it, even a memorial thereof, and burn it on the altar, according to the offerings made by fire unto the Lord. It is a sin offering. And the priest shall make an atonement for him, as touching his sin, that he has sinned in one of these, and it shall be forgiven him, and the remnant shall be the priest as a meat offering. And the Lord spake unto Moses, saying, If a soul commit a trespass, and sin through ignorance in the holy things of the Lord, then he shall bring for his trespass unto the Lord a ram without blemish out of the flocks, with thy estimation by shekels of silver, after the shekel of the sanctuary, for a trespass offering. And he shall make amends for the harm that he hath done in the holy thing, and shall add the 5th part thereto, and give it unto the priest. And the priest shall make an atonement for him with the ram of the trespass offering, and it shall be forgiven him. And if a soul sin and commit any of these things which are forbidden to be done by the commandments of the Lord, though he wist it not, yet is he guilty, and shall bear his iniquity. And he shall bring a ram without blemish out of the flock with thy estimation for a trespass offering unto the priest. And the priest shall make an atonement for him concerning his ignorance wherein he erred, and wist it not, and it shall be forgiven him. It is a trespass offering, and hath certainly trespassed against the Lord. Let's pray. Dear Lord, we thank you for this day. We thank you that we're able to come to church today, Lord, and sing songs like Victory in Jesus, and how we can have victory through our Savior, Lord, and how he died on the cross and rose again the 3rd day. And Lord, I pray that you bless our pastor as he comes before us to present your word, Lord, that he would present it clearly, and you just give him a good presentation, Lord, and Lord, it just want to tickle our ears today, Lord, but you would convict us of sin that we've committed, Lord. And we get serious about God and stop playing around, Lord. And I just pray you help us to do the right thing, Lord, and listen earnestly and come to church to hear things, Lord. In Jesus' name, amen.
Yeah, thank you, Danny. Leviticus chapter 5. Last week we looked at Leviticus chapter 4, obviously. In Leviticus chapter 4 we had basically talking about the sin offering, we had also seen what 4 types of people in the land could commit a sin offering, to not do the things that were not right. If a soul shall sin through ignorance against the commandments of the Lord, you in general are right with the Lord. You in general are serving the Lord, and you're seeking His face. You're not in rebellion against Him. You're not backslidden. You're not any of those things, and you're doing in general what you're supposed to be doing for the Lord. But then you in ignorance or thoughtlessness. You may know about the command, but you just kind of, at that time, maybe you're overtaken in the flesh. Maybe you were overtaken in some moment, because sometimes there are things that we know to be right, but because the corruption of the flesh, we will oftentimes go ahead and do it anyway. Or because somebody caused us to be angry, the works of the flesh will well up within us, and then we will do something after that momentarily insanity, if you will, of not being, obviously we're a new creature in Christ and we're led by the Spirit and all this stuff. But at times the flesh just gets out of hand, like say a rider is riding a horse, and the rider is generally in control of that horse. But then all of a sudden something freaks out the horse, a snake along the path, some loud noise, and then what happens to that horse and rider? That horse suddenly takes over control and goes wild, maybe runs off the way. You've seen those coach wagons in the movies where the horses are running like crazy, and the riders, the driver's no longer in the driver's seat, and he's hanging on for dear life. He can't. The reins won't work, and so he has to get down there in between the flesh, and he could be hard, and he has to get those lead horses and just kind of draw them in before he falls over the cliff. Was it because the driver was not an expert in controlling these animals? No, in general he can control them, but just something happens, the flesh wells up. And so even when you do something in the flesh and you say, oh, I knew exactly what I was doing, a lot of times that flesh will well up, and because the flesh needs to be under submission, because it cannot be obedient of its own self to the things of God, so the Spirit has to say, no flesh, this is what you're supposed to do. And so when that flesh gets welled up, the Spirit within you, this is how you know you're saved. The Spirit within you is like, man, this is wrong, and this is wrong. And you're like Paul saying, oh man, the things that I should do, I don't do, and the things that I do, it's not right. And so forth, because your spirit is saying, this is not right, but the flesh is like, oh, I want this, I need this, I want to express myself, I got to relieve tension, I got to do these things. It's the flesh within you doing it, but you as a saved person cannot sin. You're like, oh man, this is so wrong, this is not right, I wish I could control this thing. People with besetting sins in their lives, they have that same thing. The flesh is just controlling them, and their spirit is just like, man, I wish I could get this thing under control. I have this thing in the flesh, that thing in the flesh, and you see, it's not you that liveth within your body that's doing it. And a lot of times you sometimes relax. And you say, well, I'm just going to take it easy today. I'm just going to let the horse wander around where it wants to go. The horse knows how to get home. The horse knows how to do all this stuff. So sometimes we kind of aren't in control of that flesh. And then thoughtlessly, however that word works, thoughtlessly, I don't know if that's a word. I don't think that's the word. But without thought, there we go. Without thought, you allow your body to do certain things, and it transgresses the will of the Lord, because the Spirit, it's quickened by the Lord, it desires things of the Lord, and so this sin of ignorance is oftentimes when you allow the body to do what it does without control of the mind. And so the flesh will cause you in ignorance to do certain things, and that's what it's talking about. It's not talking about now tonight we will get into this thing. People will say, well what about saved people that they know what's right and it's not in their conscience, and they just kind of, I'm going to do it anyway, and the presumptuous sins, knowing it's wrong and being premeditative in it. Occasionally there are those type of people, but we'll talk about this tonight. In general, the Christian, though, is not that is seeking the will of the Lord and doing the things of the Lord. They're not going to be in besetting sins. They're not going to be premeditatively thinking, well, I can do this and I can do that, because the majority of the time those are hypocrites. Those are people that that are not saved, but they want to have an illusion of salvation. They want to look like they're saved, but in their heart, the Spirit is not alive to convict them of anything, because they're premeditating, they're secretly scheming against the things of God. And so, but there are times when a person sins unto death that God says, hey, you're allowed, even though the Spirit within you is saying, hey, this is wrong, but you're just kind of like a little weakling in the corner of a spirit in the corner, allowing the flesh just to rage and do whatever it wants, and you're just like, well, my flesh likes it, so that's okay, I guess. I just really don't. I think there's more advantage to following my flesh than anything else. And those presumptuous sins you allow the flesh to do in your knowledge can lead to death, can lead to chastisement, can lead to destruction. Well, we'll look at that tonight in the matter of Ananias and Sapphira, which I believe were saved because they gave up the ghost, but they did it premeditatively. They acted as if they were not saved, allowing their flesh to have some lust and desire for monetary gain and praise of the flesh. And so we'll talk about that tonight. But in general, the average I want to serve the Lord Christian is not going to have that problem. In general, their problem is sins of ignorance, allowing the flesh to have momentary control, or because the body was so wrecked before salvation that they have something that the flesh is so strong in, and they're so weak in the spirit that they're not able to control, and it's besetting sin that they struggle with daily and have to take care of daily. Otherwise, it'll fall back into their old ways. So in chapter 4, we looked at the priest, and then we looked at the congregation as a whole. Verse 13, led by the elders, led by those who were in charge, and then we looked at the ruler, and so forth, and then we looked at the individual person, and we looked at how these people work together in submitting one to another, especially in the church, and especially in society, and in general, in that one Spirit, because we as Christians are one Spirit in the Lord. That same Spirit that is in me, that quickens me, is the same Spirit as in Daniel and Rudy and Jason and Brother Dirk and everybody else. We have the same Spirit, and so we must, if our flesh is out of control, then we need to have the Spirit, in essence, gang up on our individual flesh and control that flesh. If I have a problem in the flesh, and I know the Spirit and you guys can help me control my individual flesh, I need to submit one to another so that flesh is under control. That's why church is so important, to have control of that flesh, that it can never be submitted to the will of the Lord. It's never going to be saved. And when Christ comes back, we're going to receive new flesh, a quickened, clean flesh, a renewed flesh. But until then, that flesh is like a wild animal that can be subjected to the Spirit daily, but we need help controlling that through our individual flesh. Needs help through that singular Spirit we all have. And so we understand the importance from last week, the importance of having unity in the Spirit, so that the flesh of each individual can be taken care of and controlled and so forth. Not because we're hypocrites and we're afraid of what the other person might think or do about us, but because we are of one Spirit, wishing to control our flesh. The convictions are our own, and not the group think, if you will, of my flesh is going to control your flesh. That's the world's method, is that a bunch of flesh gets together, and whoever's groups of fleshes are in control, that's whose will you're going to follow. It's the evolutionary mindset of the strong survive, and so you better join with my group and be on the right side of history. There's none of that in Christianity. It's just the one Spirit, submitting ourselves to that Spirit and controlling that flesh. And so chapter 5, we look at some important foundational things in which the individual and all of these four people in general can sin, and oftentimes thoughtlessly so. Sins of ignorance that we oftentimes don't think about, that are foundational to a lot of things. The first part, it says, if a soul sin. Now remember, understand, it doesn't say a person. Some translations say person or individual or something, as if just in general a person, which is, a person is body, soul, and spirit, but this is talking about a soul. Sometimes your spirit will want to do something, but you decide not to. Sometimes the soul, the flesh will lust after something, but you obey the spirit and subject that thing. But at the end of the day, it's the soul, the mind, the individual person that decides whether they're going to follow after the flesh that quickened them, or are they going to follow after the flesh follow after the spirit that quickened them, or follow after the flesh that leads them to lust and leads them to conceive sin and so forth. And so we have here, if a soul sin and hear the voice of swearing. So there's an individual who's going along and he sins by swearing to do something. Whether it's good or bad or whatever, whether he hath seen or known of it. So this first situation is societal, especially is if I see you, Daniel, going off and saying, I'm going to go beat up Jason over here, and I don't say anything about it. Yeah, okay, I see equally, skill versus brawn and all this stuff. But he knows where the wires are, so he'll zap you. he'll make a Tesla coil and zzz. But anyway, So we understand that if I hear him making a vow, it's kind of like, especially like when Paul first became a Christian and he was witnessing in the temple, and then he finds out that his fellow Pharisees weren't very happy that he converted, and they made a vow that, we're not going to eat or drink until this guy is dead. Then they had to set him over in the basket and so forth. So it's kind of that general thing, is that if a soul sin, if you see somebody vowing to do something that is wrong, or is in the process of doing something wrong, or has done something wrong, and you know about it, but you don't tell the police officer, you don't tell the judges, you don't tell or witness to the fact, and you don't stop the sin. So this thing, the first thing that they deal with in a particular sin is you saying, remember, sin is stopping short of what you're supposed to do, knowing to do right but don't doing it. You know it's wrong for somebody else to sin, but that's not my business. It's saying, well, I'm not sinning, so I don't have to do anything about that. I know they're doing wrong, but I don't want to get involved, and so because it might come back on me, and so I'm not going to do anything about it. So oftentimes, especially when you live in the harder part of the neighborhood, you're like, I have to live with these people. Now, obviously, you pick your battles and all this stuff, but the fact remains is the first sin that they deal with is societal sins. Because if you see something going on that is wrong, and then you kind of in this generalized way say, man, this world is just so evil. I just wish it was a better place. And then you've allowed and you've not informed the authorities about sin that's going on in your own neighborhood, and that you know specifically about, and that you can witness to and get rid of. If you don't get involved in that, you're allowing the sin. You see how that works? You see and understand the importance of a society to put away sin from among the people. And the only way that you can, a lot of times people say, well, that's the police officer's job. He has to find out about it. Well, the thing is that if you know about it, you're supposed to tell the police officer. If you know about it, and especially if the government's doing something evil, you say, well, that's just government and evil government. We got to take up guns and stuff. No, you need to vote the guy out of office. You need to go to your city council. You need to do all these things. And so oftentimes, the Christian, they in general are doing what is right. And they're regulating their own souls and so forth. And they're trying to live the Christian life. But then they put a blind eye to something evil going on in their neighborhood. If you see somebody across the street selling pot, you call the cops and say, hey, is this legal pot or is this illegal pot? Around here in Washington, you got to ask that question. My local pharmacist. But anyway, the fact remains is that if somebody's selling pot under the street lamp, it's probably not legal there either. I don't think so. And so, especially, side note here, when I was working over at the intermodal Greyhound and Amtrak bus station, train station, once that law became legal, we started having bombs, doing stuff out in public, and selling each other pot and stuff. I was like, hey, you can't do that here. They were like, but it's illegal, man. It's legal. And I was like, no, you got to have a pot shop. You got to go into these things. You can't just do this stuff out in public. You can't just exchange this junk without a receipt. You know, there are laws. There's regulations. This stuff is garbage. You're going to ruin your life on overdosing on this garbage, and you're going to be stupider than you already are. But anyway, that's a whole nother issue. There's a reason why they're called potheads. But anyway, I don't want to go into that. And if a soul sin and hear the voice of swearing and is a witness. No, there's a difference between you hear a rumor and then you go out and spout out that rumor. Well, I heard the situation, and it's not a situation at all. The person for some reason is growing oregano. I don't know, and you thought it was pot, and so you have no idea. I have no idea who would sell oregano, but anyway. But I could see where Bridget would say, in my garden I've grown a bunch of herbs and I have oregano and I just can't use it all. It's going to go bad, so I'm going to go give it to my neighbors. And some neighbor comes along and is like, you are selling pot! You know, all that's garbage. But obviously, a situation that hardly ever happens. But you understand the difference. You understand the difference between witnessing something and hearing a rumor and going off and spreading that rumor. We as Christians should not be gossiping. Well, I heard this person is selling this and that. I heard this person is doing this and that right or wrong. But if you've heard it, you're not a witness. But if you've seen it, that individual directly, not indirectly, but directly is doing something, and you have information, you have knowledge, you have not just the guesswork, but this is actually happening, you need to go and tell it. That's not being a tattletale. You know, sometimes you have little kids, one beats up another, and then, how'd you get that black guy who broke that window? Well, don't be a tattletale. Don't tell the parents that who broke that window. No, that's not tattling. That's scriptural. You understand the difference between tattling, which is, Mom, he took my toy, and nobody took any toy or whatever, or it's already that person, they're just spreading rumors. You know, such and such isn't being nice to me. You know, I mean, just not things that are crimes, not things that are issues, but it's just, there are some things you just need to deal one-on-one with, but crimes and situations and sins that you cannot deal one-on-one with. Like, you go up to the individual who's selling pot under a street lamp who got a gun tucked in his pants, or, hey, you shouldn't be doing that. That's not right. That's sin against God and all. And then he's like, yeah, whatever, man. You know, you can't do nothing about that. You need to go get the authorities. You know, I'm picking on the local pharmacists because they're easy ones to pick on, but the thing remains is that it can be the local pharmacist, or it can be some other crime, you know, whatever it is. You get the idea is that if you know it's wrong and it's against the law, and if it's something that is not right, and you can go and the authorities say, hey, come to me and tell me about this stuff, you need to go and do it. And that's social responsibility. Now there are things that are not Christian, but are not necessarily wrong according to law. Those things you should not be calling up 911 saying, this man over here is not morally right with the Lord. You know, you don't do that stuff. That's just silly. Now, if the guy's a member of your church, and you see him doing some evil, some wickedness, and you've gone to him already, and you say, hey, brother, this is evil and this is wicked, and they don't want to deal with it, then you take the 2 or 3, you do the Matthew 18 thing, and you deal with it. But to go around and say, well, such and such a person doing this bad thing, I'm going to spread this rumor. I don't know why the pastor doesn't do anything about this. I don't know why they're just allowing this thing to happen in the church. Well, for one thing, you're spreading rumors. You're being rude about it. You're doing something evil and wrong by spreading gossip, but not actually doing something about the situation. And then you expect the pastor to know about it when he has no clue, but it's you spreading the rumor and just general ill will. No, you need to be following Matthew chapter 18, and you as an individual, if they're a member of the church, you need to, as an individual, deal with it secretly and say, hey, brother, this is my concern, that you're doing something that is not right, and it's violating the law of God, and members in the Bible were expelled from the church because of what you're doing, and I'm coming to you quietly to see if you can take care of it and fix it, and just kind of, and then you'll talk to them, and they say, oh man, I'm struggling with this thing, and then maybe you say, well, either I or the pastor, I'm sure, would be willing to be your counselor, your helper in this area to help get that flesh under control, and you have that general concern as a Christian for one another, and then you develop it. But if he's like, this is fine, I have Christian liberty, I got all this stuff, I have liberty to sin, that made grace may abound, whatever. No, you don't. You have liberty to not sin. You're free from sin, so why then be bound to it again? Now that's what liberty is about, being free not to do sin anymore. The lost person is not free from the flesh. His flesh is in control. Whether his flesh is good or bad, his flesh is in control, not the spirit. And so you understand the difference there is that if I see whatever the situation, whether it's a church issue or a Christian issue or a legal issue or a social issue, I need to go to the proper authorities to have this thing taken care of. If at all possible, I need to go to that individual first to just cut it off at the root, and then therefore nobody ever knows about it, nobody ever needs to know about it, and then it's taken care of. Now there are certain sins in the flesh that are so vile, so corrupting, that even if your spirit is saved and quickened, that flesh is so vile and corrupting that you need the group to come together and keep your flesh in subjection. They need public knowledge about it, and you as an individual need public knowledge to keep your flesh in subjection. And so that is very important to be open about where you are. Not to, if you have a vile, corrupted flesh that cannot be controlled by your individual soul and spirit, you need to make that sin public, because that's the only way you're going to have victory over that. By the church together, submitting one to another, helping one another. Now, obviously, should that mean I should bring up every single little sin that I struggle with? No, because every little sin in your life does not need to be open. That's why Matthew 18 tells you first take care of it individually, privately, as secretly as you can, because not everybody needs to know about it. Then, if you still struggle, get your small group together. Even Jesus had three disciples that were his core group. And then if that still doesn't work, and you're struggling with it and you know you need help, then make it public so that the whole community, the whole church, the whole body of Christ can help you. Because we're not here to divide. Even the person who's in rebellion gets expelled from the church. As a fellow believer, the only reason you get expelled is because you're in rebellion. And you're handed over to your flesh, so that the flesh will be destroyed, but the spirit saved in the day of redemption. And then when you finally humble yourself, come back, it's our obligation to help you. It's not ever, the attitude should never be in the Christian's life is, well, you have a vile sin in your life, and therefore we'll never, ever be submitted to you. But there's a difference between, obviously, if somebody's in a rebellion, you should never have fellowship with them. If somebody's called a brother and they're in fornication, you're not supposed to eat with them. You should have no communication with them. But if they're in humbleness and submission, even if they're struggling, then we should welcome them. But we should never welcome somebody in rebellion. And you submit to me, you conform to me, and allow me to have my sin, and you just love me anyway as a Christian. No, there's none of that garbage. You submit to the will of the Lord in your brothers, the Spirit in your brothers, and you, even if you struggle with that sin, you have accountability. And then we will talk about your reunification with the church. We're not going to have sin in the camp just because you want us to conform to you. No. So if sin and hear the voice of swearing, if you hear it, whether it's in the church or in your community, you go to the proper authorities, you take care of that thing, otherwise it's your sin as well. So you understand that important thing, foundationally, that sin does not just belong to the individual, it belongs to the society in which you live and work and grow in and develop together. Because society, obviously it's the family that raises the children, but it's society together that will have the family influences first, but society secondarily, and even the church in a third role. Because the church doesn't have your children every single day. The societies public systems, especially in our society today, has the secondary control of the family. The family has the most time together, the society has the second time together, and the church has the third time together. That's just the way it is in our society, unless you're doing church, school, or whatever, or homeschooling. Then that society there is a big influence. So if you take advantage of the public system, or if you live in a community, you're not out in the boondocks somewhere and have no fellowship with anybody else, then you need to make sure your society is not allowing these sins to grow in their society. You need to, as a public servant, to take care of those things. So that's the first thing we see. If a soul sin and you hear and know about it, you need to make it known. None of this hiding and like the Catholic Church, shipping people around whenever issues occur. None of that garbage. It's going to be taken care of locally, and we're not going to ship it over to somebody else. And he says, in the second situation, so we're going to see about 3 or 4 things here. The second situation that is fundamental to understanding the importance here is, or if a soul touch any unclean thing, whether it be a carcass of an unclean beast, or a carcass of an unclean cattle, or the carcass of unclean creeping things, and it shall be hidden from him, he shall also be unclean and guilty. Now there's 2 levels to this unclean thing. People oftentimes say this garbage about there being this is about some ceremonial cleansing, ceremonial this, ceremonial this, as if we have some ritualistic religion that doesn't teach anything. It's just a ceremony. No, it's not a ceremony. It has 2 things to deal with: filth and filth, spiritual and physical. So if an animal is dead and there's bugs on it and it's crawling around and it has corruption in it and it's going back to the earth and it's spreading of disease, dead animals spread disease the greatest because there's no immune system in them to stop the growth of bacteria, viruses, and diseases. And so if you touch that, and this has a third primary meaning as well. 3 things I'll deal with here is that physically it'll spread disease. Whether you know that you touched the animal or you don't know you touched the animal, you still touch the disease, and the disease is spread by whatever else you touch. And so this has a primary understanding to understanding how viruses are spread, physical diseases are spread, and you're not supposed to do that. But it also shows you how the virus of sin can spread as well, is that even if you don't know about what sins are influencing you in ignorance, when you have that in your life, like Brother said this morning about anger, and causing the anger causes bitterness to the other individual. Anger being a sin, let not wrath go down, let not the sun go down on your wrath. Deal with it that day. Because if you have long-term anger, like the brother said, is that long-term anger has the ability to grow in others. You touched anger and allowed anger into your heart, and you spew out anger in your life and your demeanor, then you're spreading the disease of sin to other people. You're allowing to grow in you and to fester in you Satan. Tonight we'll learn about how people, even saved people, can allow Satan to grow within their members and within their flesh, to be filled with Satan, and so forth. And so we need to understand, even if we're led by the Spirit, your flesh can get so corrupt and you can follow the flesh so much that you allow Satan to control your flesh. Now, Satan is not going to cause you to sin, but he can whisper in your ear and allow those things. So you need to understand that even if you know about touching sin or you don't know, then you're still guilty of it. Because even if you touch an unclean animal that has disease in it, whether you had knowledge that you touched it or not, like a virus and a bacteria, if you touch virus and bacteria on this table, you would have no idea. Maybe there was chicken on that table you had your mom or dad cook for lunch, and then you as a kid, not knowing what you're having for lunch, stick your hands on the dirty table which hasn't been cleaned, and you don't know about it, and you just wipe your hands, just like chicken guts and stuff, and listeria is all over you now, and you go play with your toys, it's all over the toys, you can play, and so you understand the importance of you being mindful of what you touch. You understand how you can spread viruses and colds, so as a society you need to understand and be mindful of what unclean things you are touching. if a soul touch any unclean thing, and then list kind of generalized, but the general thing is unclean things. And so you understand the importance societally that we not touch unclean things. Has nothing to do with ceremonial cleanness. This has to do with actual cleanness. Don't be a filthy person and be mindful about it. Occasionally, you in ignorance will become dirty. So what do you have to do about it? You have to clean yourself, right? You have to make yourself clean. And the same general thing applies. He says, if a soul touch any unclean thing, whether it be carcass and unclean cattle, the carcass of unclean creeping things, and if the hidden from him, he also shall be unclean and guilty. And so when you touch an individual who's unclean, and you shake their hands, then you become unclean as well. You see how sin spreads as well. In the same way with ideas. If you spout out an idea that is wrong and evil, and somebody hears it in their ears, they might spread that same evil and vile sin vocally. Same way with the gospel in the good way, in the different way. Is when you speak the words of life, and people hear that in their ears, they're able to receive the words of life, and the words of life quicken them, which is Jesus Christ, through our verbal transmission of words. You know, the Word was with God, and the Word is God. And if you understand that, then you can understand especially how sin can be transmitted vocally and physically and all this stuff, and culturally. And so too can the Word of Christ be transmitted vocally and culturally as well. And so we need to understand this secondary foundational thing is that you need to be mindful of what you are touching, what you are saying, what you are doing. And so we understand this in the physical, and we understand this in the spiritual in regards to sin, and we also need to understand this in regards to who we are hanging out with. The Bible says in 2 Corinthians chapter 6, verses 14 through 18, it says, "Be ye not unequally yoked together with unbelievers, for what fellowship hath righteousness with unrighteousness?" Clean and dirty. "And what communion hath light with darkness? And what concord hath Christ with Belial? Or what part hath he that believeth with an infidel? And what agreement hath the temple of God with idols? For ye are the temple of the living God, as God hath said, I will dwell in them, and walk in them. I will be their God, and they shall be my people. Wherefore, come out from among them, and be ye separate, saith the Lord, and touch not the unclean thing." So you need to understand that the unclean thing, whether it be a dead carcass, same way in the spiritual area, is that if that person is a lost person, if he is dead in trespasses and sins, yes, it's important for us to soul win. It's important for us to be kind to sinners in order to lead them to life, to quicken them, to reconcile them to the Lord. But in general fellowship and friendship and just, I'm hanging out with this guy every single day, and we're just the best buddies. He just happens to be lost and he happens to be saved. What's the Bible say? Touch not the unclean thing. Same way with the person who is in sin. Same way with the person who's saved spiritually, but their flesh is overcome by fornication or by wickedness or corruption. The Bible says, touch not any unclean thing. So you need to understand that your fellowship must be with the Christians that are in fellowship with the Lord. If your corruption, if you say, well, so-and-so is just not on the same spiritual level as I am. In other words, double speak for basically they're in sin and won't get right. Versus, no, I'm not talking about standards and I have this conviction, you have that conviction. I'm talking about actual sins like fornication, lust and lying and abusing their children, being an infidel at home and all these things. The actual sins, not convictions. Now convictions are just standards of purity and want to be closer to the Lord for an individual. That's a different subject altogether. But what I'm talking about is that the person's lost and you touch and you handle and you hang out with and you allow them to have influence over your life. We can talk to lost people at work and so forth, be a witness to reconcile them to the Lord and cleanse them, but you should have no fellowship with the lost workers of iniquity, whether they're saved or lost, whether they're, because remember, the saved or lost person who is in sin doesn't have their flesh in subjection, and their flesh is a dirty carcass. And so you need to be aware of those things while you're allowing to touch your spirit and your soul, because then it becomes clean. And obviously we have to work with with our, we have the professional, with our workplace, the individuals that we talk to, in day-to-day life. That's not a problem. Paul talks about that in his passage. But if we know of a brother, or if we know somebody who's trying to influence us as a friend, we need to have those in the right community. We need to have those with clean people, not filthy people. He says, touch not the unclean thing, and I will receive you, and will be a father unto you, and you shall be my sons and daughters. Lord Almighty, it has to do with fellowship with the Lord as well for us to be clean. But on the converse of that, people often say, well, you are that society. You're not at the mental level as me. The Bible says in Acts chapter 10, verse 15, when 3 times Peter had the animals come down that are all dirty and filthy and stuff on the unclean animals on the sheet that came down from heaven 3 times, and Paul was like, Lord, I've been a Jew from my birth, and I've never touched any unclean thing. And the Bible says this verse. It's very important you understand. Acts chapter 10, verse 15, and the voice spake unto him again the second time. He says, what God hath cleansed, call thou not common. And so you need to understand the difference between somebody who's filthy in fornication and sin and wickedness that you should have no fellowship with, versus the individual who is not of the same nation as you. The Gentiles were generally considered heathen, and the Jews were generally considered a righteous nation. And so they would have no fellowship, regardless of who they were, of the surrounding nations. But Christ is saying, hey, I saved that individual. That individual is named Cornelius, and he's a Gentile. Don't think that he's part of that lost world that you should have no fellowship with. I've cleansed him. What I've cleansed, call not thou common. You see, the lost person is acting in a common way, but the saved person, regardless of what nation, or regardless of their physical abilities, regardless of their cultural ability that they live in, whether Chinese, English, your enemies in the world, maybe they're Iranians, maybe they're from Syria, or they used to be part of an evil cult of Islam or something like that. And you as a patriotic American would be like, I don't like that man, bomb them all, or whatever. No, the Bible says, what God hath cleansed, call that now common. You should have better friendship with them than you do with somebody who's another patriotic American. You should have fellowship with whoever God cleansed. Regardless of their past, their physical or cultural or mental differences from you. Those things are not common anymore. Those things are your brothers and sisters in Christ. You should fellowship with them. And so you need to understand the difference in those two things. And so we're moving on. We got 2 done, and we got basically 2 more to go, I guess. But hopefully we'll be able to get that done in the next 15 minutes. We'll see. Maybe 2 more hours. But anyway, if a soul swear, pronouncing with his lips to do evil, this verse 4, to do evil or to do good, whatsoever it be that a man shall pronounce with an oath, and it be hid from. So the first 2 things, if you see evil happening, you need to make the authorities aware of it. You need to not just hide that sin. You need to, the best of your ability, to be able to rid that sin from society. The second part of it is making sure that you know who your relationships and your fellowships are with. Making sure that they're not with unclean things. Making sure that you're not calling clean things common things and so forth. And making sure that your fellowships are appropriate and right. And that your association with the lost world is only in the manner of professionalism to do your job in society and so forth, and in the manner of reconciling them back to the Lord, reconciling them and helping them in spiritual matters, not talking about hunting and fishing all of the days of the life and talking about secular things. Well, this is just my secular friend. You should not be having that type of thing. Third thing, if you promise to do something, you do it. See, you understand how these are foundational to your life and attitude in society? Because if I say, oh, I'm going to show up to church tomorrow, and I don't show up to church, you see a lot of that a lot of times. Somebody on Soul Winning, I can't remember how many times we've heard this, is that, oh, this is interesting, I'm going to try you guys out. And they pronounce with their mouth to do something, and yet they don't do it. I probably like the last year or two, specifically 10 to 15 people, they're like, oh, new church? Oh, wow, I'm going to go check you guys out. I'm going to be there next Sunday. I'm going to do, and I had a few apologize, well, I didn't make it, and they never showed up. You guys don't see them here today. The thing is, they pronounced with their lips to do something, a good thing, but then they didn't go and do it. And so oftentimes, that's American society. To be polite, I promise to do more things than I can actually do. And so, this is the next level. This is sometimes the hardest thing to do with Christians, because how oftentimes we tell a brother or sister, we hear something happen, oh, I'm going to pray for you, and you never do. It's so common to you to say, I'm going to pray for you at the moment, and you promise to do something for them, and at the moment, and then you're like, well, I forgot, or this happened, or I meant to do it, I was honest about it, but it just didn't happen. You promised to do something, you just didn't do it. And so oftentimes we tell, and we don't even mean to actually do it. It's just a nice thing to say. It's just like as natural as saying good morning. I'll pray for you. I'll pray about that. I'll help that. But you're not praying. You're just in passing saying something nice, and so forth. And the Bible says here in verse 4, if a soul swear in pronouncing with his lips to do evil or to do good, whatsoever be that a man shall pronounce with an oath, it shall be hid from him. See, this is talking about when you go out and curse. May the Lord blank this, and you're just like basically telling the Lord to curse something, and just you're using that as a curse word. God blank this, God blank that, and you're telling the Lord to curse, place a curse on this thing. And you're telling it to be done, or you're just saying, I'm going to go punch that guy in the face. I'm going to go do these things, and you're just talking out of your mouth. There's a ruder way to say that. You're just talking wrongly, and so you basically it's saying that you're going to do something without actually meaning to do it. How oftentimes you see the shows where the guy who they put in jail who's innocent, but it was because I'm going to kill you, because they're so angry in the moment of anger they said something they did not mean, and so therefore it's on witness, and they got to prove themselves innocent and all this stuff because they said something they did not mean and did not go through with, which the authorities said, oh, you probably went through with it, so we're going to restrain you. The same way with our life today. So oftentimes we make New Year's resolutions. I'm going to lose 20 pounds or whatever. I'm going to make a promise. Or a big problem I see in a lot of churches is faith promise missions. Now it's a good thing in theory, but to promote in your churches to make a promise for the year, and then you suddenly find out that you're not able to keep that promise. If you can keep it, it's a wonderful thing for finances, get missionaries and all this stuff. I understand the point. And I understand the point of doing missions and having an extra offering. And if if we do faith promise and we promote faith promise here, right now we're doing our tithe and concerned with that. But in general, we will say tithes and offerings. And you can give an offering and you say, hey, I would like this to go to certain missionaries or this or that or the other thing through the church. Then I'm more than happy to accommodate that. But I think that we should not do that by a promise for the future, because that's just setting up individuals to fail. To promise to do something that you may not have the ability to do. Well, I'm just stepping out on faith. No, you're promising something you don't know if you can do or not. And so you need to be very careful, especially as pastors wanting to increase the tithes and wanting to increase participation, call out for somebody to make a promise for something. And that's why you have not heard me tell any one of you, I want you to make a commitment to do this, I want to make you promise to do that, because I'm setting you up to fail. Bible says that if you make even if you don't know about a promise or a swearing or a vow that you make, and you're ignorant of it, you're still responsible for it. So if you say, I'm going to kill you, and you don't come across it, obviously you're not going to kill your fellow brothers, and you're just angry and you're just expressing yourself, being very mean and evil about it. That is a sin. That's wrong. You should never do that. You should never swear. You should never curse something and tell God to do something to something if you don't mean it. Because if you get mad at somebody and say, God blank you, then, and God does, you're responsible for what God did for it because He was fulfilling your vow, your thing. Maybe an angel that God has looking over you says, "Oh, you want me to do that? You'll regret it later." But in the Bible, angels have done that sort of stuff. But anyway, so you understand the importance of making sure that your yea be yea and your nay be nay. According to the Bible, Matthew chapter 5, verse 33 through 30. This is why I'm not into, especially as a pastor, leading people to do promises. No, I understand stepping out in faith and making sure missionaries are funded and stuff, but I think that should be, if you give an offering, have it for that month. If you give it and you're able to, just give it, and don't expect to be coerced into a promise that you made to be forced to do that. Matthew chapter 5, verse 33 through 37, we get this command from Jesus Christ. It says, "Again, you have heard that it had been said of them of old time, Thou shalt not forswear thyself, but shalt perform unto the Lord thine oaths." So even if you're in ignorance telling these things, you have to perform it. This is what you've heard from the time God gave the command in Genesis, basically in Leviticus here, to fulfill your oaths. Up till now, you've heard of old time, Jesus is saying. You've heard this, you know this is common. But he says, of old time, thou shalt not forswear thyself, but shalt perform unto the Lord thine oaths. But I say unto you, this is Jesus instructing us, His church, His people, on how we should deal with these oath things. Don't say, I'm going to pray for you, I'm going to read my Bible more, I'm going to do these things more, I'm going to. You should not be saying, I'm going to. You should say, okay, I'll be there if I'm there, and so forth. And if you're going to do it, just do it. Don't make a vow to do it. In other words, I'll be there, and then be there, and so forth. It says, but I say unto you, swear not at all. Just do it. And neither, do it or don't do it. Neither by heaven, I'll be there, hell or high water, I'm going to be there. Don't be making those vows. For it is God. Don't swear not at all, neither by heaven, for it is God's throne, nor by the earth, for it is His footstool, neither by Jerusalem, for it is the city of the great King. Neither shalt thou swear by thy head, because thou canst not make thine hair white or black. But let your communication be yea, yea, nay, nay. For whatsoever is more than these cometh of evil. So we need to understand this and not be, even for a good thing like faith promise and good things for promising to do better and New Year's resolutions. They're all good things to do. But once you make that vow, and you'll see this in the scriptures, you're required to keep that vow. There are things that people regretted later that they've done. And the Bible says, just do what you're going to do without a vow. Say, you can say, I'm going to try to be there on such and such a day and show up. Do the best you can to show up. And if you can't make it, and you said, I'm going to be there, then you just call up the individual you said you were going to be there. As soon as you know that you can't be there, say, hey, I said I would be there, but I just can't make it, I'm sorry. You make sure that your yea be yea and your nay be nay, and don't add a vow to it. Well, I'm going to make sure I'm going to be there, and on the Bible, I'm going to be there. And then you call up the friend later on and say, hey, I said on the Bible I would be there, but, I can't be there. Now, the problem with this is, one, it says, I'll be there, and then you call up and say, I wasn't able to make it, I'm sorry, I can't be there. That's your yea, nay, nay. But if you say on the Bible, and then you can't fulfill that obligation, it's not just the obligation against him, you swore on the Bible that you would be there. And so you can apologize to your friend, but what about your vow to the Bible? What about your vow on that thing? That's what Jesus is saying here. Swearing by heaven you're going to do something, swearing by a third party, basically. You don't want to add that third party in there if you may or may not be able to do it. Otherwise it comes of evil. It causes harm. And so we have that as that third one, just trying to squish the rest of the chapter from verses 4 to 19 in there. It is, amen. But anyway, he knoweth of it, then he shall be guilty. And so we need to, basically the first thing is if we hear sin, we need to report sin. If we touch sin, we need to cleanse ourselves. We need to make sure that we're not touching dirty things, not being filthy. And then thirdly, if we say we're going to do something, do it. And the third thing here is about the sin offering. Then he shall bring the priest, and the priest shall take the handful. And if you notice here, it lists all the things. Verse 11, but if he be not able to bring 2 turtle doves or 2 young pigeons, then he that sinned shall bring of his offering a 10th part in an epath, and so forth. And you list it here, it talks about bring a lamb, bring turtle doves, and it lists them. The most you're able to do, if you can bring a lamb for your sin offering, bring the lamb. If you're not able to bring a lamb, bring the young pigeons. And if you're not able to bring the pigeons, bring the flour. And basically the general idea here is that it's going to cost you something. If you do something that is wrong, then you need to give something to the Lord. But the Lord doesn't want to say, well, you're required to have a pigeon here, and even though you can't give a pigeon, therefore you cannot be forgiven. No, it levels it to where if you can eat, you can bring something. Maybe you might have to, because of your sin, forego a meal and give that meal to the Lord. Then that's what you're going to have to do. But you're going to be able, if you're alive and you're surviving, and you're not in emergency mode, you're going to be able to fulfill the sin offering. In other words, there's a sacrifice, then you get right, and thank the Lord that the Lord is all our offerings today, and we don't need to bring offerings, and we just need to pray to the Lord and get right there. We don't need to go to a priest and all that stuff anymore. But back then they needed to in order to get right in fellowship with the Lord again, not to get saved again, but to get right with the Lord. And so there was always an offering for the poorest person to be able to do this if he was aware of it and he confesses his sin. And the priest shall make the atonement for him. It says the priest doesn't have the option. If the guy brings the sacrifice, the priest can't say, well, I don't like you, so get out of here. Now the priest has to. The same way with the Christian today. If your brother or your sister comes to you and says, I know my sin, I've done wrong by you, I've hurt you, and I'm going to make things right, then we are obligated as priest of the Lord, as Melchizedek priest, to receive that person, to make atonement for that person, to say, Lord, I understand this person sinned against me, or sinned against, especially as the pastor, to let somebody back into the church. If they're submitted to the will of the church and they're submitted to one another, then I'm obligated to say, well, I still don't like it. Get out. No, I have to do my due diligence. And then this last part here, verse 17, and if a soul sin and commit any of these things which are forbidden to be done by the commandments of the Lord, though he wist it not, he is guilty, he shall bear his iniquity. Then let's go verse 14. First, and the Lord spake unto Moses, saying, if a soul commit a trespass. The two differences here is sin offering for regular things of the commandments, then a trespass offering. The difference between the two is a trespass offering is in regards to the Lord's spiritual things. So it's one thing if I do something in society and I commit a sin in society, and it's completely, and then I have to go to the priest to get right with the Lord again. It's another thing if I go to the priest or go to church or I go to the temple and I violate the commands of the temple. See, there's a difference between just general violation and sin and not doing right in society and then not doing it right in the Lord's house. See, in this passage, if you study it out, I don't have time to go into it, but if you study this out, you'll see that the trespass offering is the same as the sin offering, but the trespass offering is when you trespass and offend the Lord directly. The sin offering is basically if you violate the commands of God in society against your brothers or something like that, and then you have to give the sin offering. But the trespass offering is if you violate God directly. You go to God's house. It's one thing to do something in your house, and then another thing to go to God's house and do that same thing. Now, a lot of things can be forgiven in the family, you were mean, or oh, sorry, Dad, I didn't mean to do this, and versus you go to church and you insult the Lord's pastor, you insult the Lord's elders, you insult the Lord's people at church, versus just your regular family. It's worse for you. It's worse thing. There are things that you may get away with, or you may have your own personal convictions at home, but then when you go to the Lord's house, when you're at your house, you determine how things are done in your house, and God gives you liberty there. But if you go to God's house, wherever God put His name, whatever church you go to, and you violate God directly at His house, then that's a trespass offering. You violated His house. You didn't violate just His laws. You violated His house. And so this last part in chapter 17 or verse 14 on is talking about violating directly to the Lord. And for that, it's not just a pigeon. It's not just a bunch of flour. But you also have to, in addition to a ram, you have to add 20% to it. You have to add a fifth part there too. And so, in other words, if a soul sin, and of these things which are forbidden be done by the commandments of the Lord, though he wished it not, and he is guilty, he shall bear his iniquity. He shall bring a ram without blemish out of the flock with thy estimation for a trespass offering unto the priest, and the priest shall make an atonement for him concerning his ignorance wherein he erred and wished it not, and he shall be forgiven him. And also here in verse 16, it says this, it says, and he shall make an amends for the harm. You've harmed God's house. It's not just a sin of ignorance, you've actually harmed God's house. When you stand up in the congregation and you do something that is wrong, or you say something that is wrong, you violate God's command, you see a wrong thing in the church, you promise to do something to the church versus a brother or sister, and the church you promise to do it, then you've harmed the Lord. If your church has a faith promise offering, and you promise to give XYZ dollars, and you don't do it, then you've caused harm to the mission field. You've caused harm to the missionaries. You've caused harm to the finances of the church, which is worse than if you went out and bought a soda when it's not in your budget at home. That's not a big deal. But if you go and say, church, I'm going to do this, I'm going to give this offering, I'm going to do that or the other thing, I'm going to witness to such and such a person on behalf of the church, and you don't do it, then you've caused harm to the ministry of Christ. You've caused greater harm than to something in your personal life versus something in God's life. So you understand the difference between a trespass offering and a trespass in the Lord's house, or a sin offering. So this fourth thing, so we see the three things here, is basically the first thing is not to allow sin in society to go unpunished. The second thing is to make sure that you're not associating with wicked people, whether saved or lost. And the third thing is not to promise with your mouth to do something and not do it, especially when you promise on the Bible, or you promise by heaven, or you promise by your Mercedes in the carport or whatever it is that you have. Mine wouldn't make much of a promise, but anyway, you understand it. And then the fourth thing is treat God's house more important than your own house. Treat God's things, especially in our time now, treat the promises you make at the Lord's house, or the things that happen at the Lord's house, more important than the things you see in society, because the atonement is different here. For the offering in society, you bring a lamb or a kid or a goat for a sin offering, or you bring. If you're not able to bring a lamb, you bring the turtle doves. You're not able to bring a turtle dove, you bring a tenth part of an ephah of fine flour. And so you understand there's a level there. But in God's house, you bring a ram. He shall make amends for the harm that he's done to the holy thing, and shall add a fifth part thereto. However much that value of that ram is as an animal in society at that time, you're going to add 20% of the value of that animal to the Lord's house. If you make a promise and you can't fulfill it, especially I think in regards to the tithe, the same principle applies, is that if you want your tithe and you're not going to take the tithe off the top of your offering and to get to the Lord's house, then you got to, when you make up that tithe or whatever it is, then you got to add 20% onto it. And so, and same way here is that if you violate something versus society and just general things in general versus God's things that you promise to do and to work in, then it doesn't just require an e-path if you're a poor person. For everybody, if a soul sin and commit any of these things, which are forbidden to be done by the commandments of the Lord, though he wist it not, yet he is guilty, shall bear his iniquity. He shall bring a ram. Whether you're a rich person, poor person, you bring that ram. It's going to cost you. A lamb or a female animal or something, it's not as expensive an animal as a ram. A ram is your productivity. If your family only has one ram, and you have like five she animals, that one ram can take care of and give you animals for the next year. But if you lose that ram, you lose those animals for the next year. So you understand that. And it costs you a lot more to violate God's house than to violate the things in society. So the last principle here is to be mindful of God's things more than your own things, because ignorance for your things is not as big a price as is for ignorance of God's things. So at the end of this, we need to understand the sin offering is for sin against others or things regarding yourself. Trespass offering was for sin against the holy things of God, such as the temple, the priests, and so forth, the church of God, and so forth, the promises made at church. So in all of this, we need to understand, we need to be more mindful of the things that we are doing as Christians, not just as individuals, but as a society and as a church as a whole. Be mindful of what things we do, and not just say, oh, this is a good practice, this is a good principle, but rather say, hey, what does God say about this practice, this principle? Is it violating anything that God told me to do or not do? Because if so, then I'm causing more harm on God's house by going and do that worldly practice by not being mindful. So oftentimes we go into practices that seem cool, but we're not mindful of God in doing those things because we think, oh, look at the world, that will give us more benefit. We should not do those things. Be more mindful of God's things than with secular and personal things, because it will cost you more with your relationship with God. Even as a New Testament believer, it will cost you more in your fellowship, in your prayer life, and the things with God if you offend Him more than you offend one another. But lastly, you need to understand that regardless of whatever you do, there is still a sacrifice, which is Jesus Christ. There is still, when you know of your sin, you confess your sin, you make it right, there's always a place with the Lord to make it right. We don't have to go with a ram, we don't have to go with flour, we don't have to go to a priest, but we can make things right with the Lord directly, and then once we know that, as the church, once we know that they've done things right, made things right and more mindful, and they're not going to violate those things in ignorance again, then we need to restore them back to fellowship, just as God has. Verse 18, it says, it shall be forgiven him. At the end of the day, when through ignorance a person makes it right, then we must forgive them because God has forgiven them. He says He will make an atonement for them. Let's pray. Dear Heavenly Father, thanks, bless you, give us this, Lord. I just pray that you'll help us to understand the importance of not having thoughtless sins in our lives, being more mindful of what we're doing, whether it's in society, whether it's with the people we associate with, whether it is with the things that we promise, and whether it is with our things versus your things. Let us always be more mindful, especially if we're thoughtless at home. Let us be more mindful with your things at church than we are with our own things. Help us to be more mindful both at home and at church. Help us to be living right with you. Keep that flesh under control regardless of how we are. Don't let us be mindless within our own flesh. And just I pray